P2 was absolutely essentially involved in Gladio, and anybody, we mentioned Gladio quite frequently on this show, people just need to do a web search and they will find what Gladio was. Gladio was essentially NATO's secret armies operating in Western Europe and possibly now in the Ukraine. They're involved in terrorism, money laundering, linkages between the mafia, the far-right fascist terrorists, and the intelligence services and the military. And this is not even disputed in Italy. As I said, Imposimato's book, which came out in 2012, covers all of this, and he's in fact the head of the Italian Supreme Court, and his information is based upon decades of investigation by the police force. Now, in other words, NATO, I haven't stressed this enough, NATO has a track record of provocational terrorism. Killed hundreds of people in Italy in the 70s and the 80s, and they're still doing it in the Ukraine today.
Okay, yes. So, I think I'll say about Philip Judd, this former mayor, Tory mayor from Weston-super-Mare, is due to be sentenced next month, is he was also in the Royal Engineers. And something that I know, actually, in a book about the Army, I was quite surprised to read, was that everybody in the Army Council, every single member of it had to be a Freemason traditionally in the Army. So, I think there's also something else that needs saying here, is obviously that not all Freemasons are evil people by any means. But what's happened is there's been a characteristic change in the organisation over the decades. Slowly but surely, this organisation that in many ways was benevolent as a kind of speakeasy place where people could speak their mind freely has changed its characteristics with much darker motives taking over many of these lodges. Anyway, on to some other news now, and let's go to Westminster and hear from the Prime Minister's questions, where the Labour leader Ed Miliband was asking David Cameron, Prime Minister, about the scandal up in Birmingham.
Mr. Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, everybody will have been concerned about what has been happening at certain schools in Birmingham, including girls being forced to sit at the back of the class and the forced removal of head teachers. Mr. Speaker, at the heart of this story is a failure of accountability locally and nationally. But the key question for parents is this: if there is a serious problem at their school, where do they go to get it sorted out?
Well, first of all, let me echo what the Right Honourable Member has said about how important it is to get a grip of this issue. The problem of Islamist extremism in our schools is serious. The situation, not just in Birmingham but elsewhere this has happened, is extremely serious, and I am absolutely determined, as is the Home Secretary, as is the Education Secretary, indeed the whole government, to make sure this is unacceptable in our country. People should be being taught in our schools in a way that makes sure they can play a full part in the life of our country. Now, in terms of where you go to if you are concerned about what is happening in your school, the first place to go is to the head teacher and to the chair of governance. And while I hope we can forge real unity across the House of Commons on combating Islamist extremism in our schools, I hope that it isn't used as an agenda to try and knock down successful school formats, whether academies created under the last government or free schools created under this government.
Now, old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers, I'll come to you first on this. What are your thoughts about this whole scandal in Birmingham? Because we've had a bit of rivalry, haven't we, between Michael Gove, the Education Secretary, and Theresa May, the Home Secretary, about who is going to deal with this better, and there's quite a lot of feuding going on, it seems.
Well, that's because, in the first place, the extremism being talked about was real extremism. We're talking about terrorism, people being recruited as potential terrorists. And if we go back to the root of all of this, it's a document, the so-called Trojan Horse facts.
Oh, that's right,
which
yes. It was faxed in anonymously, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. And it's quite clear that the investigations, 4 different investigations that have been kicked off by this, it's quite clear that fax was forged by somebody. So somebody out there is trying to create trouble for the Muslim community.
What evidence is there that it's been forged, then?
There's all sorts of aspects to the facts which show that it can't possibly be true. In other words, there's elements of fact in it that are wrong, and so on and so forth. So somebody has deliberately thrown a hand grenade into the situation to set all this off. And before we go on about what should or shouldn't happen in schools, let's go back like a laser to how this whole thing started. Because the Muslim community in Birmingham feels persecuted. I'm absolutely sure about that. They feel persecuted and picked on. Now, no doubt there are problems with schools and things that need to be looked at.
Well, Martin, if we go back a couple of years, do you remember they had a CCTV camera ring around a council estate where a lot of Muslims were living in, which was there was actually no justification for whatsoever, a massive ring of steel of CCTV, and eventually they had to take the whole thing down because they realised there was absolutely no justification.
Well, no, what happened in that case, if you remember, was that they told the local community that this was all going to be to keep down street crime, but the funding for it came from the anti-terrorist squad, and it was actually an anti-terrorist operation. And eventually, of course, activists on the ground, both Muslim and non-Muslim, uncovered what was the funding stream.
So what I'm saying is, if Muslims in Birmingham are feeling persecuted, then there's a good reason for that.
Yes, and of course, we should also, when we're talking about terrorism, let's be absolutely clear. Operation Cyclone in the 1980s was the biggest undercover operation in history. It armed and trained Al-Qaeda to fight in Afghanistan. MI6 was the lead agency on that operation, which is why the French police used to call London Londonistan, because MI6 have actually got their fingers, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, for example, who they've been supporting to overthrow Gaddafi. They've been working with them for years and years and years. The linkages between Western intelligence services, particularly MI6, and extremist Islamist groups is palpable.
But what's this got to do with Birmingham?
Well, because we started off by talking about extremism, Muslim extremism. Now let's talk about the history of Muslim extremism. Al-Majah Haroun, quite likely a front organisation for the intelligence services. Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, definitely. Now, we're coming down to talk about schools and children and all the rest of it. But before we start talking about what should be happening in schools, let's just get this terrorism, extremism thing sorted out, because the root of that goes straight back into MI6 and the CIA, without a shadow of a doubt. The history is all there. Now, let's come to talk about what we're talking about schools here now. The real problem here is the education policy of successive governments of allowing, basically destroying local education authorities and comprehensive education and allowing any old body to set up a school. That's the problem. It shouldn't have been allowed. And personally, I'm in favour of having no religion in schools whatsoever. None whatsoever. And that doesn't mean I want to have in, like in France, where girls are not allowed to wear hijabs or whatever. I just don't think that religion is appropriate in schools. And in Northern Ireland, it's caused immense problems. But both Tony Blair and the current government are all in favour of religion in schools.
There should be none. But I mean, let's remember how education started in this country. It was with church schools.
All right. Well, in that case, if we're going to allow religious schools, then there are going to be Muslim religious schools, just as there are Jewish religious schools and Christian religious schools.
Martin,
and they're going to segregate girls, because that's the sort of things that religious schools do.
Birmingham, particularly, there's been an Ofsted inspection which has been found to be pretty disastrous this week, and I think even an injunction this morning telling certain governors that they're not allowed onto school premises or they'll be arrested.
Yes, but I mean, these schools were all inspected last year and were all passed as absolutely outstanding. So the inspectors have then come in quite clearly with an agenda from the government. Michael Wilshaw and Ofsted are despised by teachers, I can tell you that. They're despised. I don't believe a word they say. I don't believe when they said last year the schools were outstanding. I don't believe now when they say that they're not. I just don't believe a word they say.
OK, The Guardian, I think, would agree with you. Certainly some of the writers there, anyway, because they had an article in there this week. In fact, last weekend on Sunday, I guess it was The Observer, is the Trojan Horse row just a witch hunt triggered by a hoax?
Yes, it is my answer to that. And it reminds me very much of those who've read history of the Popish plot of the 1600s, where Titus Oates invented loads of things that the Catholics were supposedly doing, and then everybody had an extremely hissy fit, and lots of people ended up being executed and burned, and so on. And I'm afraid societies are, in fact, prone to this kind of thing, especially when you've got the intelligence services in the background running the so-called extremist groups.
OK, well, it sounds to me like what you're saying is some kind of Muslim baiting, rather like the Nazis Jew baiting.
You said it, Tony. I will just agree with you.
Anyway, OK, what are your thoughts on this, Ron?
Well, I'm not as au fait with the inner history of the Middle Ages, etc., but I do think it throws up a number of issues, and particularly the operation or misoperation of Ofsted as a body. I would agree with Martin that Wilshaw is somebody that I've got no time for at all in relation to some of the issues that he's raised in local schools here in Bristol, unfairly in my view. However, I think it's amazing that, as Martin pointed out, Ofsted came in and there was one report that said these are excellent schools, and then suddenly they're in special measures and everybody has got a problem and we have to deal with it. I do think it's quite difficult with some of the practices that go on or is required by the Muslim community, and this is not criticism of them, it's recognising their ability to practice their faith and community, and I respect that. But in cases such as in the council, for example, we have to provide areas for our Muslim workers to be able to go and pray, etc., and we respect that. But is that being blown out completely out of proportion in relation to what is required in relation to dress codes or what you can teach on the curriculum, etc.? And again, I think Martin is right that, where we've moved away from state education with a very clear national curriculum, and, if you like, a balanced or an attempt to balance approaches on all religious faiths and fronts, we've now got the ability for virtually anybody, if they've got the will, the expertise and the ability to find a building, to set up a school. And the current government seems to be pushing free schools at everybody on the basis of choice and abilities. And my concern is just how, can I say, critical is to look at the staff in the curriculum and what is being taught.
But one of the things that has amazed me about this is that there's been very little criticism of it from the mainstream press, apart from this excellent article in The Guardian by Richard Adams. I mean, he's talking about, as Martin said, 4 separate inquiries having been set up, and he says what's remarkable is how the Trojan Horse affair has got bigger and bigger, from a flimsy letter involving a handful of schools, which is full of errors, in inner city Birmingham, to a scandal that engulfs the cabinet and all the political parties.
Well, indeed, it reminds me of it's a very sinister development, and the overreaction to this is what's shocking. And don't forget that the Tory party are trying to look to their right now, because they've got UKIP barking at their ankles, and all of this stuff is creating. If you were to think about it, all of this negative publicity about Muslims in schools in Birmingham, it could lead a youngster to decide that the people of Britain don't care about Islam and that they don't care about Muslims, and perhaps they ought to be going off to Syria, perhaps, to fight for Islam. Although, of course, we do want to have Assad overthrown, and we are actually supplying weaponry to the people trying to overthrow
it. It could be a recruitment tool for Al-Qaeda.
Well, indeed, but as I said to you earlier, Al-Qaeda has, insofar as it exists, is a creation of the Western intelligence services.
Okay, also,
there's any dispute about
worth
that.
Mentioning, of course, the Trojan Horse, the Chief Constable and the Police Commissioner in Birmingham have both attacked the appointment of a former anti-terror chief. They were outspoken enough to say, well, this is completely the wrong guy for the job. Government decision to appoint a former anti-terror chief to investigate allegations of the hardline Islamic takeover has been heavily criticised by the region's top cop, Education Secretary Michael Gove. Earlier announced that Peter Clark, who served as head of Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Unit, was to become Education Commissioner with responsibility to investigate these allegations.
Absolutely absurd, and you can see what sort of message is being sent by that. So we've got a school inspection that's going to be headed by a former anti-terrorist police officer. Now, if that's not picking on the community, what is? And the local cops, to their great credit, have said, what are you playing at? Because, of course, they're doing their best to get to work with the community to keep extremism under control. And this sort of thing encourages extremism, doesn't it? It sort of gives give a dog a bad name and he'll stick to it.